my name's Sukhdev Sandhu, and for a while, I've been director of the Colloquium for Unpopular Culture, and I'm also the director for Asian Pacific American Studies here at NYU. The colloquium, in some ways, is really informed by the kind of archaeological work that APA Studies has been doing for the best part of 2 decades. It's devoted in different ways to resurrecting, thinking about carrying a torch for individuals, for cultural practices, for historical moments that have been in different ways forgotten, patronized, scorned, deemed to be embarrassing, complete failures. This evening's event is about a scene and maybe we'll question what a scene even means in this context, but it's about a scene that for a long time barely had a name, was barely remembered, and mostly uncommemorated, even by the people involved in it. It's about the Filipino-American mobile DJ scene, of course, in the Bay Area during the 1980s and the 1990s. And it's this really fertile, combustive, incredibly creative scene that Oliver Wang has brilliantly reconstructed and reanimated in his recently published book, Legions of Boom, available from many bookstores. Oliver's currently Associate Professor of Sociology at CSU Long Beach. He's a prolific writer for a number of publications and journals, including the LA Times, Wax Poetics, Vibes, Spin, Herb, The Village Voice, The Nation. He's a DJ, he's a regular broadcaster for the likes of NPR and KCET's Artbound. For many years now, he's been running Soul Sides, a wonderful audio blog devoted to resurrecting killer soul, funk, hip-hop tracks from all around the world. Oliver's going to be talking about the genesis of a project and those stories within and around it. And he's also going to be in conversation with Hua Su, who's a longtime friend of the Colloquium and of APA Studies. He's an associate professor of English at Vassar College. He's also a DJ. He's also a prolific writer for The New Yorker, for Slate, for Atlantic Monthly, for The Wire, for Rest in Peace, Grantland. His first book, A Floating Chinaman, God Willing, is coming out very, very soon. A lot of us have been waiting for it for quite a while. And rest assured, after Oliver's presentation and after Oliver and Hua's conversation, there'll be lots of times for responses, questions, storytelling, reminiscences, maybe personal cringing, depending on what you've been doing for the last 20 years. So I'm going to hand over now to Oliver, and thank you again for coming out this evening.
How's it going? You guys can hear me okay? I would actually prefer not to use the mic, especially because it does sound crazy hissy, and usually I project pretty well in lecture spaces. First of all, thank you to Sukhdev and the AP Studies and the Colloquium for having me out. I couldn't be more honored and privileged to be here. It's nice to see so many old friends and hopefully some new friends in the crowd tonight. And again, it's just an honor to be able to come out here to talk about this book, and especially to be in conversation with Hua. It's actually kind of weird to actually be sitting this close to him, because we basically been we talk every day online for the last, 15 or so years, but we almost never see each other in the flesh, so it's kind of weird not to have a digital intermediary between us right now. So for tonight, I wanted to avoid doing a conventional, here's a PowerPoint presentation lecture. Not that I don't do that, and I do it with this book, but I think given that Hua is someone who actually knows this topic pretty well, because we've been having conversations about it for years now, it made more sense to be a little bit looser with it. So what I'm going to do is begin with a reading from the book, and then I have a bunch of images and videos that Hua and I looked through, and we can use those as jumping off points to talk about different parts of the book and then maybe move the conversation to other places. So I hope you will forgive me for not doing a more conventional lecture. If you want to come up to Mount Holyoke on Tuesday, I'll be doing one there. But I'm going to begin with just a short passage from the introduction of the book. What is it about a turntable that invites your touch? Some seem incredulous that they even still exist, and they reach toward them as if touching an exotic animal previously thought to be extinct. For others, turntables at a nightclub or bar seem like an invitation for people, often inebriated, to play amateur DJ for a moment, usually to the ire of the actual working DJ. Still others, namely my then toddler daughter, like to jab the start-stop button just to see the platter spin around. For me, and I suspect many others as well, touch is how we literally and figuratively connect to a record player's purpose and powers. Everything about DJing with turntables is tactile. You pull a record out of a sleeve, place it on the platter, lift the stylus, and drop it in a groove. In watching the DJ, seeing how she or he grazes the platter or pinches the spindle, we learn how important touch is to the act and art of DJing, how that physical interaction is not incidental but essential. A turntable may be a remarkable conduit for music's pleasures, but it requires human hands to unlock that potential. My own fascination with turntables began in the summer of 1988 at a garage party thrown by a high school classmate, Sanjeev Ravapudi. Like many an amateur DJ before him, he had raided whatever home stereo equipment he could find in his parents' living room and assembled a setup in their garage. In that space, all cold and concrete, I watched Ravapudi mix records, my first time observing a DJ in action. I have no recollection if he was actually any good or not. He's now a successful cardiovascular surgeon, so apparently he has deft hands at least. But Ravapudi took the time to explain how beat matching worked, how he would slow down or speed up each turntable to get tempos to match one another in order to seamlessly mix between them. Beat matching, when done right, facilitates an endless flow of music. These days, we take that experience for granted. But imagine what dancing would be like with a not-so-seamless flow. What beat matching, among other techniques, helps achieve is a way to bring people together on a parquet and keep them there, nurturing an ephemeral community of dancers. Ravapudi was the first person to teach me how DJing could influence social bonding, and in the years to come, I would understand how those forces could work beyond the dance floor and impact an entire region. Beginning in the late 1970s and through the mid-1990s, on any given weekend in the San Francisco Bay Area, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of parties jumping off. That included garage and house parties, church hall dances, school gym dances, weddings, debuts, and christening and birthday parties, to say nothing of large-scale performances and competitions. Mobile DJs, in other words, DJs who provide audio and lighting services, ran these parties, organizing themselves into different groups, aka crews. If this was a party being hosted by one of tens of thousands of Filipino Americans living in the Bay Area, in cities such as San Francisco, Daly City, Fremont, Vallejo, San Jose, and so on, it was quite likely that the DJ or DJs at this party would be someone you knew from the neighborhood, from school, from church. They may have even been your cousin, or at least your cousin's cousin. These DJs, their crews, their audiences, the friends, families, and organizations that hired their services all constituted the Filipino American mobile disc jockey scene in the Bay Area. And from the late 70s through those early mid-1990s, the scene was a dominant part of the recreational life of Filipino American youth in the Bay Area. Even among those who did not actively participate in the parties, most would have known about them and the people involved with them. If you did not grow up in and around this scene, chances are you have never heard of it until now. Even at its height, in the mid to late 1980s, the mobile parties slipped past the attention of local media, to say nothing of regional or national outlets. In addition, unlike other DJ-oriented scenes like hip-hop, house, techno, and reggae, Filipino-American DJs never really made the successful jump from record playing, I should be more specific, Filipino-American mobile DJs never made a successful jump from record playing to record making. In other words, they had little physical media to leave behind. The mobile crews may have created a thriving party scene, but even at the best parties, once the house lights go up and everyone leaves, all that remains are the memories. Thank you.
So something that struck me was you talked a bit about, you sort of set the scene in, watching your friend in, what was his name again?
Sanjeev Ravapudi.
Sanjeev, this was the first time you actually saw someone beat match, right? As someone who DJs but also who writes, what do you think is really difficult to convey about DJing sort of in writing? What is it about DJing that I think that challenges you as a writer, that was difficult to sort of set the scene as you were constructing this book?
I think stylistically, it just the fact that people, I think, tend to take DJing technique either for granted or it's not something that they're particularly interested in. One of the things that I write about in the book is about how one of the things that inspired a lot of these young people, especially in the late 1970s and early 80s, why they got interested in DJing at all is because they were high school students. They were sneaking into clubs in cities like San Francisco on the weekends to see DJs spin. And there's one figure who's enormous in this particular respect, this guy Cameron Paul, who was a DJ at a nightclub called Studio West, which was one of the main clubs that a lot of the people, especially in the San Francisco and Daly City side of the community, they would go and specifically to see Cameron Paul. In fact, one of the people I interviewed, his firstborn son is named Cameron Paul Rivera, which I thought was mind-blowing. I mean, there have been incredible, inspirational, important DJs in my life. I would not necessarily be inclined to name my children after them. But this kind of gives you an idea of how much it was inspired. And what people like Paul were doing in the late 70s and early 80s is they had mastered nonstop disco mixing, which if any of you go to a nightclub and you hear the music start and it never stops until the end of the night and it's always seamless and there's no break in the music, that's nonstop mixing. And we completely take that for granted, but that was a stylistic innovation and invention that began, in probably a lot of places, but it's most often credited partially to Francis Grasso, who was a DJ here in New York City in the late 1960s. And he invented this technique, which I write about, called slip cueing, which again, it's one of the most basic techniques, but it's something that had to be invented. Someone had to figure out, you can do this thing, which lets you drop a record on time in tempo. Someone later out, figured out beat matching. So again, I'm sort of getting lost in the kind of the minutia of it. But to me, as someone who had to learn those techniques and the ways in which those techniques translate to your experience listening to music. I mean, imagine going out dancing where in the 1960s and 70s, the older style would have been song ends, new song begins, but there's always a break in between there. And what you want is that seamless experience so that once you start, you don't give out until the DJ stops or the drugs wear off. So yeah.
Well, I think the minutia is really important, and that's sort of why I ask. I mean, when you're DJing, you have to grow comfortable with the sound of records played at the wrong BPM, or mixing two things that one wouldn't naturally be inclined to mix together. One thing, I have known you as you constructed this entire project, and something that I could never quite wrap my head around is what this sounded like. You talked in your intro about how, unlike scenes that formed around hip-hop, reggae, house, other sort of really legible kind of music scenes, there isn't really a recorded history. So could you explain, assuming that many of us have never been to one of these parties or have not sort of heard the live tapes, what did it actually sound like? Was it genre specific? Yeah.
You got to keep in mind, by the time I started talking to anybody in the scene had already been over for 5 to 10 years, depending on when you peg, its end date. So I never went to any of these parties originally myself. I've had to kind of construct a sense of it simply talking to enough different people out there. But the sense that I would get from it is, when you walk into a space where one of these crews were set up, definitely the first thing you would notice probably wouldn't even be the music, it'd be the light display. And lighting and just having a stage setup was really, really important to them. It was, in addition to the music, it was equally important. And so a lot of them, and doing this all, in the 1980s, before there were DJ specialty stores or a way to learn how to do this, they were figuring all these things out on their own. It was very DIY. And so some of them would go to heavy metal concerts and just look at the truss, that all the lighting was set up on stage, and figure out how to do that on a smaller scale. And they would learn about different lights by going to other parties, by stealing beacons off of ambulances, by those little blinking lights off of sawhorses that a road crew would use. They would take those lights and figure out how to integrate it. They would find ways of creating their own fog machines by dropping dry ice into a bucket of water. I think my favorite example is from a crew called Sound Explosion, which was the first Filipino-American mobile DJ crew out of San Francisco. And because their name was Sound Explosion, they would take a hubcap, fill it with flash powder, and then use toilet paper as a fuse. And as you can imagine, that's not a really smart idea to have do-it-yourself pyrotechnics. And one of the guys who was in charge of the crew basically lost all of his arm hair because he didn't set the toilet, paper fuse long enough. But it kind of gives you an idea of the kind of, ingenuity that they brought. To get back to your question, though, so there would be the lighting display, and then musically, if it was a garage party or a house party, not only would you expect to hear music that was tailored towards the kids, so it would be stuff like, if we're talking about in the 1980s, New Wave was big, Latin freestyle dance music was huge, high energy dance music, leftovers from sort of disco and late era funk would have worked its way in. A little bit of hip hop and electro, depending on the year that we're talking about. But again, they're also playing for people's parents. So they would have to play a few cha-chas during the evening for their parents or for the aunties and the uncles in the house too. So you had to be conversant in a lot of different dance styles, not just, I think by the late 80s and early 90s, this is when hip hop becomes really, really dominant. And you could find crews that were just devoted to just spinning hip hop. But I think most of the crews that I write about from the early part of this scene, they had to be conversant in all of these different styles.
So with Sound Explosion, this was the first crew. What year did they form?
They formed in late 1978, and they disbanded by 1980. And in their wake, they inspired, especially at this one high school, Balboa High in San Francisco, at least 4, maybe 6 crews specifically got started because they saw Sound Explosion performing.
And in the book, you write about how Sound Explosion formed sort of as a response to the phone book DJs. Could you talk a bit about what the existing DJ scene was in San Francisco in the late 70s?
So if you were going to have a school dance in the Bay Area in the 1970s and you needed to hire a DJ for it, you went to the phone book. And so in San Francisco, 2 of the main ones were, there's one guy named Dr. Funk, and then another small, I think it was a 2-man operation called Music Masters. And so they basically had the school dance circuit on lock. But they were both an older style of DJing. They didn't do the non-stop mixing style. And so when these high school students would go into the city and go to the nightclubs and discotheques and see DJing doing non-stop mixing, they realized how kind of tired Dr. Funk and Music Master's style was. They really wanted to be part of this new thing. And so that's partly how they got started, is they started to compete for business. And because their style was much more exciting to people, they got hired, and who knows at this point what happened to Dr. I'm sure Dr. Funk and Music Masters did okay, because they probably, the phone books were still kind of a relevant thing, for quite a while.
I'd like to think that there's another discussion going on. Someone wrote the Dr. Funk book, and that his story will be told as well. But
if I had more time, I would have loved to interview him, because he was kind of a main figure in the Bay Area of that era. But yeah,
he's the doctor. So, I mean, it is strange to think about how mind-blowing it would be to actually hear non-stop mixing if one were accustomed to having these gaps between songs. What were the touchstones? I mean, you talked a bit about how Sound Explosion and a lot of the early crews would be inspired by heavy metal lighting and ambulances, apparently. What were some of the musical touchstones? Where did they learn just how outmoded Dr. Funk was?
It was a combination of certainly in the early years, just going to nightclubs and cribbing notes off of what they heard that was being spun in the city. And the thing I should clarify too is that the scene that I write about was almost exclusively a suburban scene. So even the crews that came out of San Francisco, they came out of the Sunset and the Richmond, which are the most suburban districts in the city, or in the Excelsior, which is on the other side of the border from Daly City. And so what you have there is this movement of music and ideas that begins in sort of the entertainment sectors of the city, and then they translate that in a sense out to the suburbs by figuring out, how can I replicate this club experience but do it in somebody's garage, or do it in a school gymnasium, or do it in a church hall. And so they're still going back into the city on the weekends to figure out what are the DJs they're playing. And certainly, like a lot of DJs, they learn by going to record stores. And so, I mean, just interviewing these folks, I got a list of now way long defunct record stores in San Francisco. But one of the most important ones was one called Aloha Records, which specialized in disco and dance music that used to be in the Castro. Streetlight Records, which is actually still around in that area. But they would go there and they would look at charts, they would talk to other folks. And partly once the scene really took off, it was just kind of going to each other's parties and kind of stealing notes and learning from there. And that kind of internal competitiveness helps to push them to want to break new records as well.
Yeah, and maybe we can look at some of the flyers and business cards.
Yeah, I just realized this is all completely frozen up, so I'm just going to reboot real quick. So let's put that off for like another 60 seconds or so.
So this is one thing that I've been thinking about, just the book that I've been working on also as long as I've known you, that Sukdev referenced. One thing that has really struck me as I've sort of been looking at these literary scenes is the extent to which we mistake kind of genius or creativity with kind of people hating each other or rivalries, competition. You know, a lot of change isn't actually sparked because someone has a great idea. It's just someone wants to one-up their friend, right? Or wants to do something to enter into the marketplace. So can you talk a bit about the role that rivalry played? Was it like a friendly competition? Did you sense like animosity between crews? I mean, the scenes you describe tend to sound quite wholesome.
It's funny. I think part of it is because by the time I interviewed a lot of these, a lot of my respondents, they were already well into their 30s, if not 40s, and so they're reminiscing on something that was part of their childhood and their adolescence and teen years. And I think my feeling is, with the passage of time, they've become kinder in their memory as to what things were like. And it was a few people, and I would talk about sort of the cooperativeness of it, but then someone would like, the one exception would jump in and say, it wasn't all like love and fam. Like, there was a lot of rivalry, a lot of competition, and part of it is you're competing for gigs, you're competing for reputation, which helps you get gigs. I mean, this exists in many different cultural scenes, certainly not unique to DJing. Amongst the more foul things that I heard about would be accusations of cord cutting. So if someone's doing a routine on stage, you just snip their power cord, and they're going to have some problems with that. One of the most frequent accusations you would throw against another crew is you would accuse them of using a tape. In other words, you're saying that their routine is executed way too clean to be done be done live. You must have pre-recorded. I mean, it's basically the DJ equivalent of lip syncing in essence. And so that was something that I didn't know to expect, because I'd never heard that term before. But people would tell me, yeah, we won this battle, but people accused us of using a tape because they didn't believe that we could execute in the way that we did. So there was certainly that kind of rivalry, but also just a lot of mentorship. And so Qbert, how many people are familiar with Qbert out there? Right, so he's the most famous Filipino-American DJ on the planet, and also came out of this scene. He's partly one of the reasons why I even knew about this scene, was interviewing him about how he got started. And Q started in a mobile crew called Lifestyle Productions, which was, I think, partially San Francisco and partially Daly City. And his crew was mentored by this older, bigger crew out of Daly City called Spintronics. And so Spintronics would bring, in fact, if I can get this to work, I actually have a flyer to show this. Spintronics would bring Qbert, or would give Lifestyle the gigs that they couldn't take. And there was no need, they didn't have to do stuff like that. I mean, that was basically something that was done strictly to help mentor another generation. I think this flyer, Startup Chrome. Okay, so this flyer, if you notice, so featuring MC Johnny Crush and Qbert from Lifestyle Productions. So this was a Spintronics gig, but they brought a young Qbert out. And this is before Qbert was, remotely like the Qbert we think of today. But you would see that kind of mentorship happen a lot. And the title of my...
Actually, can you explain who Qbert is for
I'm sorry.
people who may not be up on turntablism?
Qbert is a scratch DJ, aka a turntablist. He got his start in the late 1980s. By 1991, he had become the US DJ champion in this prestigious global competition called the DMC. In 92, him, Mixmaster Mike, well, here, rather than talk about it, let's actually look at it. This is part of the winning routine. They were then known as the Rocksteady DJs, but this is DJ Apollo, DJ Mixmaster Mike, and DJ Qbert as the Rocksteady DJs. All three of them are of Filipino descent. All three of them are from the Bay Area. All three of them began in different mobile crews.
It's got the mic in the middle, that's Paul on here.
So the routine, that second part, which uses, it's known as, they call it the Peter Piper routine from Run DMC's Peter Piper. Apollo was just telling me the other week that him and Mike invented that routine back in '88, but this was from '92. And so this was back when they were both active mobile DJs. That's when they first got to know each other and became friends. And they were already practicing stuff like this 4 years before they debuted it globally.
Okay, so for anyone who's found that clip kind of confusing and strange, can you walk us through exactly the skill sort of on display there?
So there's two different things that's happening there. One is simply their ability to manipulate the vinyl and stylus in a way to create new sounds and rhythms. That's what scratching is. But they're
And we're talking like a millimeter. I mean, we're talking about like
Yeah.
manipulating just tiny.
Right, and having incredible,
Yeah.
eye-hand coordination, and being able to, take a single, a bar of sound and then chop it into, 16ths or
Right.
32s or whatever. So that's part of it. But their innovation, especially in this performance, is they figured out. I mean, mostly scratch DJing was a largely individual activity, and so if you were a scratch DJ, you were by yourself and you worked solo. What these guys came up with, and partly why they won this year and then defended the next year, is they figured out how to create a band out of it. And so what you're seeing in this clip is one person is basically doing the drums, and so they're just responsible for creating a percussive beat using scratching. One person plays basically more of a melody or some other kind of rhythmic element, and then one person kind of gets to freestyle like crazy on top of that. And the idea that they could take these different elements and create a band aesthetic out of it is partly one of the things that these DJs, who eventually became known as the Invisible Scratch Pickles, it's one of the things that they helped to really spearhead, and it's what they're really well known for.
Now, would you say like the Invisible Scratch Pickles grow out of the competitiveness that we were just talking about in within the mobile scene?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you have any kind of community in which you have different groups, dozens if not over 100, all in the mix, they're going to be naturally competitive with one another simply because, again, they want to compare themselves with one another. And so I think the competitiveness that came out of in the scratch scene in a lot of ways was simply an extension of the competitiveness in the mobile DJ scene. It's all about just wanting to up your own craft, but also relative to other folks as well. I had a second thought about that, which of course has now completely left my mind. Maybe I'll come back to that.
Now, one of the really fascinating things that I remember.
Wait, I just remembered.
Oh, please.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
So
It's
in
like
San
a
Francisco,
band aesthetic right here.
in
Just jump
San
back
Francisco, and San Francisco specifically, there was a tradition of ROTC drill team flag teams.
Yo, that's exactly what I was just going to ask you
Okay.
about.
And so if you were, and for whatever reason, I think partly it has to do with the ROTC and with a lot of these Filipino youth having family that came out of having relationships with the U.S. military. A lot of them got involved in the ROTC in high school. A lot of them joined drill team. And so if you were Filipino in San Francisco, one of the public high schools, if you were in drill team, that was basically like being on the football team. That was the Pinoy equivalent in those spaces. And so Qbert specifically, and this is not unusual, a lot of the mobile DJs originally were drill team members. It's how they got to know the people that they formed their crews with. Qbert himself was a drill team guy at Balboa High School, the same high school that Sound Explosion was from. And when I interviewed Q for the book, what he told me was that simply learning how to, and if you've never seen a drill team, right, it's a coordination between multiple people carrying flags, doing routines that's within a set amount of time. And he said that's partially how he learned the kind of discipline that he could apply to battle DJing later, because that's all about executing physical movements in a set amount of time. And when he said that, it was like, so yes, drill team is the unsung story behind the history of turntablism, at least in San Francisco.
One thing I've always wondered about that is, did they also have football teams, or?
Yeah, and some of them actually were on. I mean, some of the people I knew that I interviewed were athletes themselves, and they were high school football players. But DJing was sexier in a lot of ways. Yeah.
That's cool. Can we look at some of the business cards? I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that's one of
absolutely.
the really interesting things here, and one of the ways in which the competitiveness really manifests itself. So when you began this project, did you have a sense of, I mean, there are binders and binders of these business cards, right?
Right.
Did you have a sense of just sort of how deep this archive would be, like how big the scene was?
No. One of the I didn't bring the flyer with me, but the first thing that gave me a sense of it, there was a party in the early 90s called, or actually 1996 called Agenda. And on the back of the flyer, they basically did a roll call of all of the different crews that people who put the party out could remember from back in the day. And I counted by hand how many crews were listed there, and it was 200. Not all of them were necessarily Filipino crews, but they were all Bay Area crews. And I know that there were names missing off of there because they were crews that I'd come across that weren't represented there. So that sort of gave me this snapshot of like how immense it was. But to me, the business cards actually do a really great job of that too, simply because you kind of get a sense, even in something as small as a business card, just the kind of creative energy and the identities that these guys were working with. I mean, even though I love the flyers and the photographs, I think the binders of business cards are some of my favorite visual ephemera that have survived, because you just sort of instantly get a sense of the diversity and the kind of creative energy that went into it.
Yeah, and you definitely also get a sense of sort of how everyone wants to participate, right? How the sort of my cousin does graphics school of, like I don't know how to DJ, but I can like make you a cool flyer. Were there professional promoters as well, or were the DJ crews basically handling all of that themselves?
Yeah, there were eventually, by the early 80s, there began to be independent promoters. The best one was this guy, Mark Bradford. I don't have a photo of him here, but I do have one of the flyers. He put together the Imagine series, which was largely based in San Francisco and Daly City. And Imagines were a really, really big deal. They became biannual events, and simply getting your name on the flyer, even if it was a battle, even if you didn't win, simply being on the Imagine flyer meant that you were at this sort of next level in terms of reputation. And so Bradford had a reputation as being a kingmaker in that respect. He spent a lot of money on the event, so they were really kind of ostentatious affairs. And it became a way in which people just wanted to be able to get onto the flyer to begin with, let alone performing at the event itself. The largest single event in the history of this scene was held at the San Mateo Fairgrounds. It was Imagine 7 from 1987, and there were 24 DJs on the bill. 24 crews on the bill. And in order to accommodate that, they basically had a hangar-sized space with, I think, something like 6 stages, and then 4 crews had to share each stage in order to accommodate the size of that. So if you can imagine, one crew finishes performing, and then the whole room basically runs to the next stage, which begins up, and this is sort of how they went throughout the evening. And that was one of Bradford's events.
Would you say that was sort of the high point around 86, 87 for the scene?
I think so. No, yeah, I think it's probably the point at which you have in terms of the best known crews, they're still in circulation. You have these large showcases. So Bradford's doing it in San Francisco and Daly City. In the East Bay, there's a woman, Arlene Alviar, who's doing a series called AA Productions. Eventually, there's one coming out of Fairfield called Just for Fun. And this is all happening kind of in that mid, like 85 to 1990 in essence. And it's really by around the late 80s and early 90s, some of these bigger crews have begun to fade away. And so that's kind of, you can see where it crests around that time.
And at this point, with the influence of Mark Bradford, promoters, the Imagine series, one would assume that the crowds were not just consisting of like young Filipinos, right?
Yeah, I mean, the parties were, I think, predominantly Filipino-American, and partly it has to do with the demographics of the Bay Area, is that you had these clusters of families settling in the same area. So Daly City is obviously the best known, but also Union City, Fremont in the East Bay, San Jose in the south, Vallejo and Hercules in the north. And you just had a critical mass of people that allowed these parties to be predominantly Filipino. And so I've interviewed Filipino American DJs from Los Angeles, and so if for those of you who are familiar, people in the Beat Junkies, for example. And when they would go up to these Bay Area parties, they would say it would blow their minds because they had never been to a party that was just Filipino people. Their parties in LA were much more mixed because the Filipino American communities didn't have the same kind of demographic critical mass that you could achieve in different parts of the Bay Area. But to your point, certainly, especially in the South Bay and East Bay, I mean, the people who go to the parties were very, very mixed. Daly City and San Francisco tended to be much more of the kind of predominantly, if not exclusively, Filipino parties.
So your book ends around this period of time, right?
Mid 90s.
What I mean, the obvious question is sort of what was when does the scene begin to sort of go into decline, or how does that narrative play out for you?
It's not any one thing. It's a confluence of things that all begin to merge together in the early 1990s. One of it is that scratching takes off, and if that becomes more attractive for a few reasons, mostly because in order to be in a crew is not just all DJs. You have maybe one or two DJs, and then you got someone who does lighting, maybe you have a business manager, and then a bunch of roadies who help move the equipment. These DJ groups formed, I mean, obviously for social reasons, but also because just you needed the labor, right? To be a mobile DJ, especially in the 1980s, the equipment was incredibly heavy. You had to bring out, many, many bins of records. Lighting equipment was a hassle too. So you needed a crew around you simply to do the labor of setting up and breaking and moving equipment. By the early 90s, the nightclub and radio programmers finally realized that there is this thriving DJ scene under their nose, and so they begin to basically poach individual DJs out of the different crews. Well, that's great for the DJ. The problem is that if you're DJing at a nightclub, you don't need anyone to bring your equipment because the equipment's already set up. So it's just you, it's just the individual DJ, and that undermines the sort of division of labor necessity for the crews to begin with. Scratching takes off, and scratching is an area where you can be basically a star on your own. You're not like a roadie anymore. You get to be in front. Import car racing makes its way up from Southern California to the Bay Area. That becomes another competition for sort of young middle class, and this scene was largely middle class. That becomes another kind of competing interest. And then as all of this is happening, because these are largely high school students who started it, once they graduate high school, they never really had ambitions to stick with this. They didn't think of DJing as a career. I think it's very different now, where if you get started as a DJ, you can actually envision what might this look like 5-10 years down the road. But for them, it was like a high school thing, and when they were done with high school, they were done with that. They went off to work, college, the military, whatever, start their families. It's something they left behind. And what's been interesting is in talking to these folks again now, a lot of them have begun, if it hadn't started maybe 5-10 years ago, they've been getting interested in getting back into DJing. And so people who had gone off and done, a lot of them ended up in IT, which I guess is it's a Bay Area thing, I think, has partly to do with it. But they'll start doing weddings on the side now, and so they'll if they still have their equipment, they'll blow the dust off of it, or they'll go out and get a controller or something else that allow them to DJ. But they've kind of made this kind of interesting full circle now that they're at a certain point in their life. They realized how important this was to them, and that it wasn't something that they had to leave behind. Again, I think today's generation of DJs who are teenagers, they can really envision a long-term future in a way that they never had that vision.
So it sounds as though the project for you, like, where did it begin? Was it when you began to get interested in the Invisible Scratch Pickles and sort of talk to them about their past? Like, prior to that, where did you think the Scratch Pickles had come from?
Right. So in the 90s, I was in the Bay. I was a DJ. I was a music journalist. I started in grad school around the same time. And if you were in the Bay and a DJ in the 90s, you knew about the Pickles because they were the best in the world. You knew that they were all Filipino, and you knew they were all from the Bay Area. And as I got an opportunity to interview them as a journalist, I would ask them, how did you get started? And they all had the same origin story, which is that we all got started in these different mobile crews in the Bay Area. And there was things that were being written about the history of scratching, but I had yet to come across anyone who had written about the history of the mobile crews and sort of that kind of journalistic scholar light went up over my head to say like, oh, this is something that no one's talked about. Maybe I should pursue this further. So that's really where it began, is once I kind of got a sense that there was this massive scene that no one had documented or talked about. I was thought, well, there's probably going to be some good stories in there. I should kind of dip my toes in. And the further I got into it, the more rich it revealed itself to be.
So I think we'll sort of drift to like how you conceptualize the project.
Yeah,
and your
sure.
work. There's obviously a lot of aspects of the mobile scene that I've completely ignored, and we'll leave that for the Q&A. When did it occur to you that this would be a book or a longer project? I mean, I think as a journalist, sometimes one wonders, sort of like, should I write an article about this? Is this sort of a life's work? When did it occur to you that this was going to be more than just sort of like a one-off recovery project?
So, I mean, this began as my dissertation, right? And before I had even finished it as a dissertation, Ken Wissaker, who is the editor for Duke University Press, approached me at a conference that we were at together, and he was familiar with me, I think, largely through my music journalism. And we got to talking, and I mentioned what my dissertation was, and he said on the spot, whenever you're done with it, send it to me, and let's evaluate it. And so he basically approached me from before he was even done about the possibility of it becoming a book. I was trying to think back to when I was writing it. Did I have ambitions for it at the time? And as someone who, again, had one foot in academia, but also one foot in journalism, I assume it must have occurred to me at some point that this would probably make a good book, but I don't know, especially when, as anyone out who has ever suffered through a dissertation, the tunnel vision is amazing. Like, you just get lost in that thing forever. So the idea that you're even thinking about like the next steps for it, I don't know if it would even occur to me. And Ken, I think he hit me up kind of early in the process in any case. And so I sort of, he kind of planted the idea if it wasn't already bubbling up in my mind.
Now, one thing that I've always enjoyed about your work, and I think the book is an embodiment of that, is that you have a sort of a good eye for stories. Like, you're always interested in sort of digging through, decoding the mystery of a forgotten singer or a 45 or some, stories in Los Angeles. Now, the way that we report stories as journalists is kind of different than the way one conducts ethnography. Can you talk a bit about the different approach you had to sort of, interviewing or talking or trying to extract these stories from these crews? Did you feel any responsibility to them as a fellow sort of
absolutely.
APA?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, partly because no one had done it before, and so I felt like that there's a lot that weighs on you with that. Simply the fact that they would share their stories and invite me into their homes to talk about this stuff and pull out their old photo albums. So yeah, I felt a tremendous amount of responsibility to sort of, number one, to kind of get their story right to some extent, while still putting my own spin on it as sort of the ethnographer and interrogator of sorts. I think to get back to the first part of your question, one of the big differences was in doing this project and pitching it, I never had to sell anybody on, so what's the contemporary hook? Which, as a journalist, like, I get it, and I've heard it from an editor more times than I care to remember, but with this, I didn't have to justify why at the time I was working on this, why in 2002 does anyone care about a scene that was 20 years ago that no one remembers? I never had to sell the pitch on it. All I had to say was, this was important to me, and as a graduate student, I had the freedom to go and pursue it. And I had an advisor, Michael Omi, who's at UC Berkeley, he thought it was fascinating too, and so he was down with that. I think if I had to try to figure out that contemporary hook angle, I might have never pursued it because I couldn't. To me, I didn't have an instant bridge for how to bring this history from, let's say, 1982 and then bring it up to 2002. But luckily, I never had to make that formulation.
Were there moments when you, because I think the responsibility thing is pretty real, right? I mean, you, presumably part of the reason, not to project, but it seems as though one thing that's really fascinating about the scratchbook is that they were also Asian Pacific Americans, right? Right. How much of that was was the initial draw? They were clearly also the best DJs in the world at the time, but can you talk about can you unpack a bit sort of your relationship to them as a fan, as a participant in the scene as
But
well?
as an Asian American, which I think you're asking too. No, I mean, people like Hubert and Mike and Apollo were a huge inspiration to me when I was coming up as a DJ. And so, in the same way that the reason why this scene takes off is because you go to a school dance and it's someone from your high school or it's someone from your block who looks like you, they're doing it, you realize, oh, I can do it too. I mean, a lot of ways, that's really one of the most powerful things that launches this entire community to begin with. And for me, seeing people like Hubert and Mike and Apollo and Shortcut, et cetera, being considered the best in the world, I never had ambitions to be a scratch DJ, but simply knowing they existed was just massively inspirational because it kind of gave me a sense that I could maybe fit into this or belong in a particular way. So I think that was part of it. And also coming out of Asian American studies, I mean, this is kind of a cliche, but it's completely true. Our stories are rarely told. And if I had any role to play, either as a scholar or as a journalist, to be able to get these stories told, that was important to me, because I think this is an important, fascinating history that more people should know about in that respect. And again, I think every scholar feels the same way about the research. It's not like I'm stating something that's surprising. But I think in particular, especially coming out of Asian American studies, knowing how little any kind of Asian American pop culture focus there exists within not just mainstream media, but just mainstream academia, this was incredibly important to try to be able to get it out there.
As you were interviewing folks and making connections and meeting new sort of retired DJs, did they kind of recognize what you're saying right now about sort of their stories having been forgotten, or did the sort of significance of the project occur to them as you were describing it to them?
It varied with who I talked to, but what surprised me is how many of them told me, and this was around, a lot of my principal interviews were done in 2002 and 2003. A lot of them said, no one's ever asked me any of these questions. Like, this is the first time in 10 plus years that anyone has asked me about my experience and my stories within this movement in this community. And I'm not even sure why they mentioned it to me, but it struck them as interesting and unusual that this would happen. And the more that they would dig into it, the more they realized there were other stories they had forgotten to tell that they wanted to share. I think I think they kind of took it for granted in a certain way. I mean, not all of them. A lot of them really recognized the importance of this and why it was a big deal to have anyone talk about it at all. But others, it didn't really occur to them because, like I said, it was something that they did in high school and they kind of left behind. And it was only years later, not just through my research, but there have been over the last 10 years, there have been a lot of reunion parties, so that people who grew up in the scene are now old enough where they can now promote it. They have access to different clubs and bars, and so they're throwing parties and inviting all these OGs to come out for it. I think it's really only been the last 10 years that there's been kind of this resurgent interest in this history within this community itself. And for whatever reason, there just needed to be kind of this passage of time. And interestingly, some of them are old enough where they now have children who are the same age that they were when they first got started, and in a handful of cases, their kids are now getting into DJing, which is kind of this really remarkable kind of familial full circle.
I mean, this is a very nerdy question, but sort of when they come out of retirement, are they using vinyl, or are they teaching themselves how to use Serato, or how does that work?
I would say most of them who are DJing with any kind of regularity have all switched over to digital. I meet very, very few medium-specific purists in that respect. And I think part of it is, and I think this is actually true for most working DJs I know, is that you work with the tools that you have in front of you. The type of media that you have, it doesn't really matter. It's DJing is about using the tools that you have to create the best musical experience that you can. And whether you're using digital files or analog vinyl, to them, they're really agnostic about that. And especially if you're a working DJ, it's a lot easier to do digital DJing because you don't have to, these guys are old. Their backs are going, They could just bring out a laptop instead of literally, 200 pounds of records with them. So they're definitely going to roll that way.
I was just imagining the most Asian American movie ever, the intergenerational conflict between the two mobile DJs whose son now wants to use Serato rather than vinyl.
You betray the family legacy.
So you have a lot of great images. Maybe we can sort of look at some of these and see where the mood takes us.
Well, here, let me play another video clip, and this comes from the guys in Spintronics, which was a Daly City crew. Actually, is a Daly City crew. They are one of the very few crews out of this community that are still active DJs, and they just had their 30th anniversary in September, which is extraordinary. They still throw parties. They are still
What's
well
that
in the
WAV
mix.
file?
I'll tell you later. So this is from a they put this video out. I think it was either for their 20th or 25th anniversary, and it's part of a history of Spintronics. And I pulled this little clip out because they talk about what it is that a mobile DJ does, but also what they kind of got out of the scene as participants.
Spintronics is a mobile DJ group that caters to Northern California.
We provide music and lighting for weddings, family parties, things like that.
I felt like it was a little bit more than that because we weren't just going out and playing music. It was more of like going out, family-oriented company with a lot of people that cared about music and providing the best to the audience that was there.
We started back in 1985 in high school, doing little garage parties and parties for friends.
It was basically a hobby. We were into music. We started talking, and then at the time he had the crew starting out. Then we started doing parties, and then we started accumulating equipment and records.
Our contacts got bigger and we met more people, and it just went on small and just got big.
Is that the whole clip?
Yeah, there's a second half that it's a little bit longer, but I left off.
I think in the second half of the clip they talk about how they're more than just a bunch of DJs. They're a family.
Yeah, brotherhood. I mean,
right.
yeah, they use that term.
Yeah, and I think that sort of touches on where I want to go. Where are the women in this scene? Because it seems like there are a lot of dudes in that picture of the family.
Right. Well, here's kind of one of the exceptions to the rule. This is the Go-Go's. They were an all-female, all-Pinay crew, mostly out of Balboa High School. Balboa is sort of really extraordinary in the history. I mean, they were the kind of the school in which so many important crews came out of. This is from their scrapbook. I actually got this earlier last year. I went to the house of one of their members, who's actually married to another DJ from the scene, and they had this amazing scrapbook, and I took a scan of it. So with the Go-Go's, and this actually explains part of why there were so few women in the scene, one of the members, who was a DJ herself, this woman Daphne, whose house I went to, she had to sneak out of her own home to go to her own gigs because she had a really strict curfew, which of course her brothers didn't have. And a lot of it's about patriarchy. It's about kind of these traditional Catholic families in which the women, the girls in those families were heavily monitored. And so, one of the other people that I interviewed, this woman who is now a professor at San Francisco State University, Allison Tintiango, she grew up in the Fremont Union City scene, and so I knew that she had this background. And so when I interviewed her, I just assumed that she was, because if any of you, I don't know, anyone here actually know Allison, like maybe one oh, Jesus Christ, how you guys all know Allison? That's amazing. So if you've ever met her before, she's incredibly outgoing, like like a huge personality. And so I just figured like she was constantly rolling with, her main crew was this crew called Night Lime. I don't know what the lime was about. I thought it was nightlife, and it's like there's an M in there. Maybe they were relating to citrus. But I just assumed that she was rolling with them to all these different parties. And she'd go, and she said, no, I never got to cross the bridge. And I said, why? Because my parents wouldn't let me. And so I do think that there are other reasons why there weren't more women who were involved in this. There are exceptions, and random crews will have like the one lone female DJ who came in at some point. But for the most part, even though the parties were certainly welcoming to women as party goers, as part of the audience, and they were also very much important as the people who hired. They were the clients, but to become a DJ meant that you had to spend a lot of time going out at night, and in most cases you were spending time in crews that were mostly with boys with men, right? And so the kind of patriarchal impulse to kind of keep them on lock, I think, had a big reason. It was a huge hazard. It was a huge challenge that they had to overcome. Another example is this woman, Lady J, who was one of the MCs. She came out of South San Francisco, and so there were actually a few prominent P'nai MCs who performed with these crews as masters of ceremony. And so Lady J is someone who I had heard of her name for a long time, and I finally got to interview her earlier this year. And I asked, so why did you stop MCing? And she said, well, I was dating this guy, and he didn't like it. He wanted me to stop, so I stopped. And again, that's those kinds of things none of the men have any kind of remote story that's similar to that in terms of it was either their girlfriends or their parents didn't like their activity and made them stop. They were completely supported by their families, but for the women in this scene, it was much, much harder.
And it sounds as though the model of sort of like apprenticeship was very sort of like homosocial, right?
I mean, it was. The DJs and the Go-Go's, both of the two who became the DJs in the crew, they learned how to spin. Well, actually, one of them was the girlfriend of an existing DJ. The other one was mentored by this guy, Orlando Madrid, who's kind of like this Yoda-like figure in the scene. But most of their mentors were men. And there were not a lot of there were very few women who could mentor other women, and that's a really important way of helping to diversify a scene, is when you have people who are willing to who are basically role models. And that's probably what makes the Go-Go's so extraordinary, is that they didn't really have role models, but they still went out, and even though they were only around for about 6 months, they kind of forged ahead despite having all kinds of doubters and haters, as they would put it today, and again, having to sneak out of their own houses to go to their own gigs. So the fact that they even lasted 6 months and performed at their own gigs and performed in battles, and in fact, this flyer here that I showed before was from a battle that they got invited to, and from what they told me is they got invited to this battle as a setup. Is that the male DJs they knew, these were all San Francisco DJs that were invited to this. So you see the Go-Go's there above Ultimate Creation. They got invited as a setup. The male DJs wanted to kind of show them up, and they ended up winning the battle instead. So, yeah.
What is the Junior Optimist Club, by the way?
It was for one thing is, I'm not sure what made them so optimistic, but it was a Filipino American club at Balboa High School, and they sponsored a lot of the parties that were in the San Francisco, specifically in the San Francisco area.
So, just a couple more questions.
Yeah,
and we'll
sure.
open for Q&A.
Yeah.
But you have mentioned a couple of MCs. Were there attempts to actually sort of press up records or become recording artists? I mean, I think the question of ambition is really interesting because, for a lot of the participants, one could imagine it's just a cool job to have, a cool side gig in high school, things like that. Even with the Invisible Scratch Pickles, I've always found their ambitions to be kind of strange and very specific to the art of scratching. Right. Were there attempts to actually become recording artists or to commit some of this history into recorded medium?
Right. There were two labels, Velocity and Classified, that both formed probably around 93, 94. And they were founded at least partially by people who had come out of the mobile scene. So Classified was founded by Corman Roque, who was a member of Spintronics I was mentioning before. Velocity included this guy Francisco Perdola, who was a really important member in the mobile community. And their big artists, Classified had Jocelyn Enriquez, and Velocity had Buffy, and these were both freestyle dance artists. That was the most there were. That was the extent to which they attempted to make that jump, as I mentioned in the introduction, from record playing to record making. But they never had the opportunity, unlike, let's say, hip-hop DJs or house DJs or techno DJs, to basically make their own records and create a style unto themselves. I spoke to one of the surviving partners of Megatone Records, which was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, dance label out of San Francisco. And I asked him, did you have any awareness that there was this massive DJ scene that was playing your records throughout the course of the 1980s? He had no clue that these guys were out there. And so I think part of it was, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe because they were teenagers. I think a lot of it had to do because they were Filipino and therefore kind of racially invisible to a lot of other people in the Bay Area. They also didn't have, and this goes back to the role models thing, you know, when I talked to Corman about his history with Classified, I said, so how did you even figure out how to put out a record? Did you have like older relatives or older people in the Filipino community that show you the ropes? He's like, no, we went with the library. We checked out a book on how to make a record, basically. Which, I mean, again, it reflects the kind of inventive DIY-ness that was so much a part of the scene, but it also represents that they didn't really have a kind of a built-in community way of other people who could show them how to do this and to build something bigger from that. Versus, I think if you look at the history of other kinds of DJ-led scenes, you do have more of a kind of an institutional or collective knowledge about the record industry that facilitates this transition of DJs going from record players to record makers. That moment, with the exception of Classified and Velocity, and that really wasn't about the DJs, that was about artists recording in the style that the DJs would play, but not DJs actually making records necessarily. That moment never really happens for these guys.
So when you began the project, you know, the scratch scene was still like very healthy. You know, it was a very, it was sort of one of Herb magazine
it was still a
existed.
thing.
I think that that would be one way of putting it. And as you were working on the book and as the book sort of came into fruition, that scene really evolves and changes and it gets overshadowed by other scenes. Has your relationship to the material and to that sort of initial moment changed as well?
Are you asking specifically about turntablism?
Not really, but if you want to, I mean, you could take it there, but I just mean in general, I mean, it seems as though when, you know, you talked a bit earlier about how when you began the project, or if you were to pitch this project, it would be difficult to explain to sort of like the average non-music person why this is interesting. But when you began, you know, the Scratch Pickles were, you know, incredibly prominent crew. They still are, obviously. Yeah, so has your relationship to that story changed at all?
Not yet. I think it's not unusual that, especially once, if you've worked on a book and you're done with the book, you eventually get sick of the book. And you know, I've been sitting with this research now for 14 years since when I first started, and I still love talking about it. Like that's why, again, I'm so happy to be here to be able to kind of share any piece of this. Just because I think it's just so extraordinary. I mean, certainly when I was in high school, I wasn't doing anything remotely as interesting or as innovative as what these guys were doing. And just that very fact in and of itself, I think is one of the big kind of takeaways, is that the idea that teenagers can do like really amazing things when given the opportunity and the incentive for it. And especially now that in the last 6 months, since the book's come out, I've been going back up to the Bay Area a lot for different events related to it. And you know, it's the passion that they have for this part of their lives is still so visceral. They want their kids to know about it. Even the ones who aren't necessarily DJing it yet, they really understand the kind of importance of what it is that they put together. You know, I kind of hope it generates more interest in other people exploring this, because I really just skimmed like the very tip of an iceberg that can go much deeper. So.
Well, that might be a good place to turn to the crowd and see if anyone has questions.
I'm curious, since it was like a cultural moment that was very localized, you know, ephemeral, not well documented, I'm curious, to what extent did everything that was happening there leak out to the rest of the world or the rest of the United States? You know, and looking back at the time from today, are there ways in which we can sort of understand, see the sort of legacy of what they're doing in pop culture or other things that we're looking at today?
I think the biggest legacy, you know, for better or for worse, is that it gave people like Qbert, Mike, and Apollo, Short, all these guys who later became much better known because of turntablism. If not for this scene, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, so would they have ever gotten interested in DJing at all? And I mean, it's kind of a counterfactual. It's really hard to to make a guess on. But it's kind of hard to imagine how they would have become DJs as scratch DJs if not for their involvement in the mobiles to begin with. And so I think to the extent that we have this association now, and maybe by we I mean like Juan and I, that Filipino and DJing is somehow synonymous, right? The idea that like a Filipino DJ is not a surprise concept. People are used to that at some point. That's mostly because of people like Qbert. But again, where did Qbert get his start? He gets his start with the mobile scene. So one gives birth to the other gives birth to kind of like a huge, kind of really important idea, and now has ensconced this association we have within the popular imagination that Filipinos and DJing are somehow, they go hand in hand. But I think a lot of it links back on some level to the history of this scene, even though Filipino DJs were, they were mobile DJs out here in New York and New Jersey, out in Southern California, Seattle. So it's not like a uniquely Bay thing, but the Bay did it bigger and, depending on who you ask, better than anybody else because they had these, this particular kind of critical mass that they could do it with.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, just to jump in, and this sort of relates to the last question I asked. I mean, I think there is a way in which a lot of the tail end of the story still lives on today, even though kids aren't necessarily practicing scratching the way they were maybe like 20 years ago. Like if you think about what has happened with a lot of the scratch pickles, like Mike or A-Track or other turntablists like DJ Craze, I mean, they do have an enormous influence on dance music today.
Right.
So even though it may not sound specifically like that clip you played, I mean, it does seem as though that has been translated into, different relationship to bass and sort of new dance music textures and things like that. Right. So, I mean, in a way, it's not necessarily, it's sort of like an indirect legacy of all of this, but,
right.
It's definitely very much there. Like the mixes, I don't know if anyone has heard the mix, you bootleg basically.
Yeah,
one of
with permission, but yeah.
One of the party mixes, and it sounds incredibly contemporary still, more so than it probably did 10 years ago.
I mean, I think also DJing as a stylistic continuum, like there's just, each new style borrows something from the one that comes before it. Like it's very syncretic in that respect. And so whether directly or indirectly, if you listen through the history of DJing and different DJing styles, you can find these linkages going back, globally, but also across time as well.
We're just all living the same mix, man.
Indeed. John?
So you talked a little bit about racial invisibility. And when I think of my early years writing, that was actually the moment of probably peak visibility. We're talking Scratch Pickles on the cover of Herb
yes.
and things like that. So I have two questions. One, can you talk a little bit about the after effects, positive or negative, of visibility as opposed to invisibility? Because that next generation, the generation after, or the sort of the inheritors of the legacy of your book, I think we're in a very different environment. And the second question, which is related, is let's talk a little bit about battles and how the Pickles basically changed battling. And if you think of like the DMC battles of like 87, like that, the pre-scratch stuff, and then the post, it's that to me is where maybe visibility also has very tangible effects. Right. So, talk about race and battle.
Right. Let me answer the second half, and then maybe I can work my way back. I mean, speaking of battles, there was a battle in 1989 that was held in San Francisco. No, sorry, I think maybe it was in Hayward. I have the flyer someplace. Qbert was one half of it. The other guy was this guy, Jazzy Jim, from a South Bay crew called Skyway Sounds. And it ended up becoming, looking in hindsight, like a really symbolically important moment because Jazzy Jim was of the older school. He was doing what's known as quick mixing, which is where you have two stacks of records and you whittle your way through that stack as quickly as possible. So you're basically switching records on tempo every basically 2 to 4 bars. I mean, I've seen it in action. It's amazing. And that was sort of the dominant way. And then Qbert gets on the tables, and actually Qbert's half of that performance is on YouTube. So if you look up something like Qbert 1989, you might find it. I'm not sure how Jazzy Jim's half got kind of left off that clip, but you can actually see Qbert like at a relatively young age doing it. And the judges had a very hard time evaluating who should win this because they were completely two different schools of performance. And Kubert actually ends up losing the battle, but as the cliche joke would go, he ends up winning the war because turntable becomes much more dominant than like quick mixing ever did. And so I think the battling aesthetic, which I think Hua was asking about before, these were, even if you were not in a formal battle, if you were on a bill with another DJ, there was going to be comparison no matter what. And so you always had to sort of bring your A game to this. And to your question of what did the Scratch Pickles do, part of it was they introduced the group aesthetic. And so they did that in '92. They defended, Kubert and Mixmaster Mike successfully defended their title in '93. And at that point, the organizers of the DMC, the Disco Mix Competition, asked them to voluntarily retire because they felt like if they continued on, they'd be too intimidating to younger DJs. And so they stopped battling at that point as a favor, basically, the DMC, which kind of gives you a sense of how dominant they were. It'd be sort of like asking Jordan to kind of hang it up after, 96 or something, because no one's going to want to come up after you. So I think the battling part of it, that's kind of how scratching really takes off. It kind of gives it a particular flair. It gives an attraction. With the Pickles, what Kubert and them wanted to do was, once they stopped battling, they were really invested in the artistic aesthetic evolution of what you could do sound-wise. And for them, it aligns a lot with kind of their interest in science fiction and kind of all this alien symbology. I don't know if this is what you were asking with the first part of your question, but the kind of the high point of the scratch scene happens in, I think, 2000. It's a convention called ScratchCon that's held at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. Dave, were you there?
I think I met Hua.
Okay. And this was supposed to be basically like the biggest event. It was going to be the Pickles farewell show. And unintentionally, it also marked a very quick beginning of the end to turntablism. Because in a sense, like, they kind of peaked out in terms of what was possible to do. And people sort of lost interest kind of quickly, and it fell out of visibility, I think, within really the next few years after that. And it's sort of weird that this event that was meant to celebrate sort of the achievements made by scratch DJs in essence becomes kind of like the unintentional, eulogy or elegy to sort of that scene. I'm not sure if that was what you meant by the visibility issue, but
Also, I'm curious about sort of racial visibility. I'm talking about, how
Oh, yeah.
Americans were represented in hip hop more broadly and
Right.
dance music more broadly.
yeah, you're asking if, what was the upside to downside. I think that Filipino Americans, especially in the Bay Area and also in Los Angeles, by the time hip hop had become global in a big, big way by the 1990s, a lot of them formed into rap groups or were individual MCs and wanted to get their start there. And I think in some ways they probably could see, just as performers, they could see these scratch DJs or maybe the mobile DJs before them out there performing. That sort of gave them the license, in essence, to imagine themselves doing another kind of performative act, in this case emceeing. But I do think the fact that them being Filipino still was a limit because people just couldn't figure them out racially. They suffered from what I describe in another essay as kind of racial inauthenticity as a result. And it's kind of notable that the most prominent Filipino in hip hop is Chad Hugo, who's also known as the quiet guy in the Neptunes, right? And whether that's a coincidence or not, I always find that kind of interesting in that respect. It's really not until you see Bruno Mars that you have a really prominent Filipino American in pop music where he's not just behind the scenes, he actually gets to be in front of the camera. So, Dave?
Can you talk about the role of hallucinogenics with Kubert? Because this guy seemed really focused. And
I've never had that conversation with him. You might know more about this than I do.
I mean, when he came to play at a rave in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There's the middle of the rave, and there's Kubert going bananas on Rock the Bells for maybe 15 minutes, and he was out. I remember he was saying, and Mixmaster Mike too was speaking to that they always like to take a few hits when they're practicing. And I remember Mixmaster Mike's eyeballs would kind of jiggle around a lot when he talked about it. He's pretty excited about it too.
The guys that I spoke to, there was very little mention of drugs or even alcohol, which, again, that doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It just means that they were selective in what they chose to share with me.
Whatever happened to the Sugar Fragger?
So do you want to quickly give people a quick background on what the Sugar Fragger show was?
I think I mean, he wore a paper bag over his head, kind of like the unknown.
I thought you meant
horns.
yeah. Sugar
His DJ
Fragger.
disc.
Sugar Fragger was a DJ who performed with a paper bag over his head. And again, I'm not even sure who he was, but this guy in the Bay Area, Billy Jam, who was one of the big proponents of the mobile scene, he would put out a series of both CDs and later videos called the Sugar Fragger Show. That was basically just like 90 minutes of turntablist nerdery. But Sugar Fragger in the videos, it would just be a guy scratching up a storm with a paper bag over his head, and but that was so with horns. But that was not unusual. People had names like Yoga Frog. Weirdness kind of came with a lot of the elements out of the Bay Area in particular. The Beat Junkies were never that wacky in that respect. Maybe it was the hallucinogens that you're talking about.
So I think it's definitely tied to Tribulation '99, the film which came out of the Bay, because they play that in the background too.
So again, this is you know much more about this community than I do in that respect. Yeah. In the back.
Hi there. So my background, I guess, is I'm a dancer, among other things. And so obviously, hip hop came about from DJ Kool Herc and DJing at essentially sort of the equivalent parties up in the Bronx, and that kind of influenced the way in which b-boying kind of evolved. I guess my question is sort of like, is there any particular parallel in which the mobile DJ Filipino party scene influenced dancing in the Bay Area? I've been out to the Bay Area. I've met a couple dancers who are Filipino and also DJs, and I've always heard a lot. If you're a DJ, you become a better dancer, and if you're a dancer, you become a better DJ. Off the top of my head, Dennis Infante, one of the best lockers in the world, Cool Raul from Supreme Soul on America's Best Dance Crew, and I'm pretty sure at least a couple members of the Jabbawockeez are DJs as well. So I guess if you could comment on the relationship between dance and the mobile scene.
It's a great topic, and it's one that there's definitely a history to be written about street dancing in the Bay Area, especially in the 1970s and 80s, that is yet to be written. And I think it's actually the reverse. I think it's really a lot of the street dancers, funk dancers, and later b-boys were a big influence on the mobile crews. A lot of crews, well, not a lot, but at least several crews, DJ crews, began originally as dance crews. So there's a group called Kicks Company that began as dancers, and then they became DJs. And that was not an unusual story. So DJ Apollo, who was a member of that Rocksteady video, he toured with DJ Premier and Branford Marsalis as part of Buckshot LaFunk. Apollo, before he became a DJ, he was a breaker. He was part of the b-boy scene in Daly City, and the War Memorial was a spot where all the dancers would meet up. These guys had a lot of maybe older siblings or cousins who were part of the funk dancing crews in the 1970s in San Francisco and Sacramento, the Poppers and Lockers that you're mentioning. So I think dancing was actually preceded the DJs in a lot of ways. But because of that, they're used to thinking about dance music. And I think that sort of translated as they made this transition from dancing to DJing. And certainly a lot of the early parties, I'm trying to think of one of these flyers has a good example of that. But a lot of the early 80s parties were almost always competitions of not just DJs but also dancers. Like they were always, those two things went very much hand in hand. It wasn't until more like the mid 80s where you don't see dance competitions listed on the flyers as much. There was some kind of break at that point. But in the early 80s, it would be very unusual not to see some kind of dance competition if there was also a DJ competition. Those two communities were very, very tight.
Hi. A couple minutes ago, you talked about visibility, and one thing that stood out to me was how you mentioned racial inauthenticity. Could you just kind of unpackage that idea and what you meant by that?
It's sort of the idea that like racial authenticity, especially within a cultural context, I guess the kind of the colloquial way to put at it is that no one thinks it's unusual for you to be in a particular kind of cultural space or sphere. And for Filipinos, not so much in the DJ world, but as MCs, when a lot of them started, people would just look at them like you don't belong here. Somehow you were racially inauthentic because you don't meet up with this image that we have in our head as to what a rapper as an MC looks like. And so, I mean, some of the other research that I've done through the years have been on largely East Asian, so like Chinese, Korean, and Japanese American MCs. And this is a problem, really in some ways less so with fan bases and really with record executives. And so they would be in front of like some kind of marketing exec at a major label, and they're interested in maybe signing, this an Asian American rap group. And the kind of the marketing ideas they would come up with would be like, well, what if you came out to the stage with a gong and were wearing like Kung Fu monk robes? And so it's sort of like, we have no idea what to do with you because you don't match our idea racially of what an authentic rapper is supposed to look like. So that's sort of what I mean by the racial inauthenticity. So it's just when you wander into a space and people are like, what are you doing here? You don't really belong here. And on a very basic level, that's kind of an example of what that looks like in that respect.
So just to build on that, when thinking about the Beat Junkies, Invisible Scratch Pickles, Fifth Platoon on the East Coast, I mean, it always struck me that like were the DJs themselves having a version of this conversation? Because it seems, as though it would have inevitably come up when, for example, like Babu looks at what's going on in the Bay Area, or when Vin Rock moves to the Bay Area, and just sort of happens to conglomerate with Shortcut and Apollo. Like, was this a conversation that they themselves were having about sort of what their place was as this sort of racially inauthentic DJs?
That's a really good question. I've never asked them that particular question, and it would be sort of, I mean, the ways in which the people that I spoke to for the book, the ways in which we got into race and ethnicity and identity, a lot of it had to do with just them, to what extent being Filipino was meaningful to them as being part of this scene. And much to my surprise, it wasn't at all. Like, very few of them would have described their scene as a Filipino scene. I mean, they recognize that, yeah, all of us are Pinoy or Pinay in here, but that's not why we're doing it. Like, we're not DJing as some kind of way to express some kind of Filipino identity. For them, their ethnicity and their ethnic identity was largely kind of incidental in that respect. I suspect it might be different for kind of the younger generation, if only because coming up through hip hop, in which race and identity were so much more at the forefront, especially out of the 80s and early 90s, I would expect it might be slightly different for them. But for the mobile guys in the 80s, being Filipino was really completely secondary to why they got involved in all, if it mattered in the least.
Thanks. I kind of grew out of this scene. I started DJing in '93, so I kind of got influenced by the mobile scene. I actually got into DJing because I like to dance to the parties, and I grew up in Southern California.
What city?
Cerritos.
Oh, Cerritos.
So I grew up with Rhett DJing my junior high dance. And when you talked about the racial inauthenticity, he got signed with Brotherhood Creed, and they made him change his name because they didn't think it was, correct to have him. So what I wanted to ask you about is like the economics of the Filipino scene in order to become DJs, because a lot of these kids were high school. I started at 18, and some people in my crew were like 13 and 14. So the economics of a middle class income in order to create a mobile scene, like all those business cards were all high school kids. It's kind of mind-boggling to see that type of business through that community. So can you talk about that?
This is where the fact that they are the children of an immigrant within an immigrant community becomes really vital, because a lot of how they got their referrals for gigs came through extended family networks, and especially for an immigrant community, there is a vested interest in maintaining strong ties to the people that are, if not are part of certainly your immediate family, of course, but your extended family, or people who came from the same province as you. Like, you made a point to have organizations or other forms of other kinds of institutional manifestations that allow you to stay in contact, which meant that if you were a crew and you needed business off the bat, you could basically ask your parents, who of course probably loaned you the money to buy your equipment to begin with, who's getting married, who's having a birthday party, who's having a graduation party, and their families became their referral network. And that was an incredibly powerful advantage they had is because this was a community in which, again, you had extended families that were in close contact. You had Filipino-American youth groups within churches, within high schools and colleges. They were throwing business. You had Filipino provincial organizations and clubs that would also hire them for parties. And so through all of these things, partly what allowed the economic capital to circulate within this was that this was a very close-knit immigrant community in which one person could basically know 5 other people who could all potentially give you business. And that's, a lot of these crews, their first gigs were basically for family members on some level, whether it's a birthday party or garage party or somebody's wedding. That's how they got their foothold in it. And they could build from that and then do school dances and the church dances and eventually the big showcases that we were talking about.
So you do mention the fact that they had organizations. Can you touch upon the immigration, the second wave of Filipino immigrants that come in the 70s are professional nurses, engineers, that give them the opportunity to have these types of communities in the Bay Area and provide like a middle class
Right.
income?
So overwhelmingly, the people in this scene, their parents are part of, and then them themselves are part of what's known as the fourth wave of Filipino immigration, and it follows the 1965 Immigration Act, which finally wipes out what had been decades of restrictive quotas for people, especially from Asia. And Filipino Americans in particular they take strong advantage of the family reunification clause that came with the 1965 Act. So they're sponsoring siblings and parents and other relatives to come over. And a lot of them initially settle in the kind of dense central city parts of San Francisco, like south of Market, the Mission District. But then those who have middle class means, that's when they make this secondary move out to places like Daly City, which is suburban, like like Fremont and Union City and San Jose. And because these are young people who are coming out of middle class families, to go back to the point before, I mean, these are families who have enough excess savings where they can loan or gift their kids the money to buy equipment, to buy records initially. These are families that have, in California, if you have a single family house, you're going to have a garage that comes with that. That's a perfect space to throw a party, and so garage parties become a really big part of it. That's partially owing, I think, the class architecture of California plays a huge role in it. Certainly there were people who were living in like apartment housing that would have loved to have gotten involved in DJs, but they had not only do they not have a place to throw parties, they don't even have a place to store equipment, because if you're living in like a 1-bedroom apartment south of Market, where are you going to put that stuff? And so, class is a huge part of it. This was overwhelmingly a middle class suburban scene, even though their musical and sonic ideas were obviously very much influenced by the city. Yes?
Actually, being influenced by the city, I was wondering, I'm from Texas originally. There was a huge Hispanic community with a lot of mobile DJs. And it feels like the Latin freestyle played a big part in that scene as well, with the Filipino mobile scene. I was wondering if you ever talked to them, or have you ever asked that, where their influence came from? Obviously, you talked about Sound Explosion, and you talked about Cameron Paul. And Cameron Paul has his long history of kind of electro breaks, kind of things. But do you think that was more of an influence, or do you feel like they were kind of coincided, hand in hand together, that the electro and kind of Latin freestyle world kind of went, together? I don't know if they ever kind of touched on that.
So what's your question? You're asking about the influence of, like, how did Latin freestyle become part of it?
Yeah, well, I guess not necessarily that specifically, but the direct influence was Cameron Paul, the Africa Bambaataa, essentially, for this world,
No, if only because Cameron Paul was big with a very select group of people who were, in and of themselves, important and influential in the scene's history. But he was DJing primarily in San Francisco. So, there might have been people coming up from San Jose or down from Vallejo to go to Studio West to see Paul. But that would have been a hell of a trek, especially if you're in high school. Versus if you're in San Francisco or Daly City, it's a lot more convenient. So Paul was really important to, I think, a lot of the DJs in the SF and DC scene. really the main influence on future DJs were the previous DJs. So I mentioned before, Sound Explosion starts off at Balboa High in '78. They end in '80, but they leave behind 4, 5, 6 crews in their wake, and those crews would go out and inspire or influence new crews to start. And so it really creates a life of its own at a point at which you don't need to go to the nightclubs anymore to learn how to DJ. You just go to the parties and you study their styles instead. And so it became the scene becomes self-sufficient in that respect. Which is sort of the irony, because the nightclubs eventually helped to kill off. They're not the only piece of the puzzle, but the nightclubs eventually helped to kill off the scene by, after like 10 plus years, they start rating the crews for individual talent. And that's kind of where it began. So again, another kind of full circle there. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. So I wanted to know whether this trend made it back to the Philippines itself, and whether there was a fan base in the Philippines towards these, groups that were coming out.
It's a great question, and it's something that if I were to go back and re-interview them again, it would probably occur to me now to have asked that. I didn't at the time. What's interesting is there's a handful of DJs who came out of the Bay Area who have since moved back or moved to the Philippines. At least one of them runs a record store out of Manila, and so there's sort of this travel back and forth that happens. What I'm curious to know about, and I don't have an answer for this, is whether or not there were DJs in the Philippines who heard about what was happening in places like California, and that inspired them to get started. But the thing is that, mobile DJing in the 1970s and 80s becomes a global phenomenon, largely because of, I kind of included this flyer from the mid-70s, because mobile DJ technology just takes off in the 1970s. So there were certainly mobile DJs in the Philippines that owe nothing to what was happening in the US. It was just because DJing became big throughout the world at this time. But given the kind of transnational movement of people within those families, it wouldn't be surprising to me to find out that there were examples of DJs who kind of went back and forth, or to help influence people get started out in the Philippines. But I don't have a specific answer to that, unfortunately. It's a great question, though.
I had a two-part question. So you spoke a lot about, what you researched and what you found and what you saw, but like you, I grew up during that time, and so it was a big part. Like, I met my boyfriend at an underground. He was with the DJ, so it was like still important to me. What was your personal experience of how, you said you were a DJ, but what was your personal experience in the whole scene? And then the other part was if you could talk more about DMC, because to say that Hubert won or whoever won sounds big, but what exactly is the scale that we're talking? How many people are competing and that kind of stuff?
The first part of the question was my own history in the scene. And the simple answer to that is I didn't have one. But by the time, so I came to the Bay Area in 1990 when the scene was still happening, but I didn't hear about it until really more like, 1998, 99, 2000, and by which time those...
Well, you're talking about the mobile scene, right?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Not just sort of like the Bay Area.
Oh, yeah, I thought you meant like specifically the mobile scene, like I missed it, like late to the party on that one. With the scratch scene, I was kind of at ground zero in the Bay as that was happening, and I still remember reading, Neva Chonin writing about when Hubert won 91, she wrote an article about him, and I was sort of like, who's this Filipino DJ from the Bay Area? One of my favorite memories is the first time I saw Shortcut this was probably in 94, 95. He was competing in the regional West Coast DMC Championship. I think it was at Club DV8 in San Francisco. And this is where he debuted what has become kind of one of his signature performances from that era, which is the Impeach the President juggle. Again, this is getting into really nerdy stuff here. But what a juggle is, you take two of the same record and you go back and forth very quickly to create a new rhythm based off of the existing drum pattern. And so you're basically reconstructing on the fly entire new percussive rhythms just using two of the same records. I'd never seen a juggle perform, let alone as deftly by Shortcut. And that shit blew my mind. It was such an amazing routine to kind of witness. the second part of your question with the DMCs, so the Disco Mix Championships begin in the early 1980s. And for hip-hop DJs specifically, I mean, the other one was, what was the Clark Kent one?
New Music.
Yeah, New Music, right. But DMC eventually became kind of the dominant competition for hip-hop DJs throughout the 80s and 90s at the height of when this is happening. In terms of the number of performers, I mean, it certainly grew through time. I think at the point at which Qbert and the Rocksteady DJs win in '92, you know, I'm guessing it's probably a few dozen countries are competing. But you know, by the 2000s, you know, it's dozens more. You know, one of my good friends was China's first DMC champion, and I think he won that title around maybe 2000 or 2001. And so, as scratching kind of proliferated throughout the world, you know, these nascent DJs wanted to kind of get into DMC because it was the biggest thing going around in that respect. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to describe the scale because it's not like, you know, EDM DJs don't compete. This was a very specifically a hip-hop DJ competition, but it was something that if you were a hip-hop DJ, you knew what the DMC was. And for most of the 80s, it was either won by people out of Europe, out of New York, or out of Philadelphia, and then these Filipino kids come out of the Bay Area and just completely melt everyone's mind. And for the rest of the world, it's sort of like they came out of nowhere, even though, you know, they'd been bubbling up for well over a decade, but it wasn't until like 91, 92 that the rest of the world actually got to see what the hell was happening in the Bay. Thank you all for coming out. This is fantastic.